And now we present to you Thac0 with Advantage.
Welcome to Thac0 with Advantage. We're two friends that have been playing D&D a long time. While we both love lots of other RPGs, D&D surrounds us. It penetrates us, bringing our fandom together. Hi, I'm Ange. I love gaming. I'm also realizing I stretched myself a little too far, and I'm trying to get ready to run 2 brand new games at a convention this coming weekend, and I have less than 24 hours to get everything ready. Focus is not my strong suit. Ooh, shiny.
I'm Jared. I haunt the internet and various podcasts, my opinions inculcating listeners and readers who have no inkling of my deepest, darkest secret, which is that I really don't know what I'm talking about. If you would like to sample more of my inculcation, you can find various things that I have written on gnomestew.com and whadoiknowjr.com.
Inculcation? That's like a 50-cent word.
After we look at the games we're running in the campaign journal, we'll be talking about space opera as fantasy. Then we'll have some recommendations of D&D related content for you to check out in our downtime research segment.
Now stand by for station identification. This is WD&D the Role Player. Now we're going to Mac McKinney in the morning game with Wolfman. In 1976, TSR published Metamorphosis Alpha, a game about a colony ship carrying the remnants of Earth to a new home in the stars. But over the course of its mission, the inhabitants have formed a low-tech society that no longer realizes that they're on a colony ship, with the core gameplay loop consisting of exploration and relearning how to use the high-tech tools of the past. So we're making things space and D&D with a twist? You know the deal, Wolfman. People want 80% the same and 20% different with some quality execution. Stupid popularity. Give me some counterculture anytime. Wolfman, it's D&D. It's counterculture already. Anyways, we could talk about how the AD&D First Edition Dungeon Master's Guide had conversions to this game so you could have your D&D characters wander the Starship Warden. Or about how this was the inspiration for the expedition to the Barrier Peaks and the Gamma World RPG. All the mutations, all the time, Gamma World! But according to James M. Ward, the designer of Metamorphosis Alpha, without this game, we may not have had a dedicated monster manual. Apparently, after seeing the separate bestiary booklet for the game, Gary Gygax decided that AD&D needed a separate book to consolidate the monsters in the game all in one place. So it wasn't a money grab?
Let me just finish up this campaign journal.
In my old Margrave game, they continued up the tower through the secret entrance they found, subsequently bypassing pretty much every single encounter along the way. But they found the treasure! Yay! That said, there was absolutely no way to avoid the encounter at the top of the tower with the ogress guarding the eggs. As an odd note, the adventure as written in the new Old Margrave book says the leader of the band of brigands is an Etten, but the imagery is still an ogre.
Yeah.
And the stats in Shard were still an ogre.
That's so weird because, yeah, I remember it was specifically she's like a mutant ogre in that adventure.
Yeah, and it basically, it even had this little nice fun note of like the two heads arguing with each other. But everything else was an ogre. There were no Etten stats at all.
Yep.
Not to mention no cool art of an angry Etten lady, just cool art of an angry ogre lady. So rather than tell my players to pretend she had a second head arguing with her, I just turned her back into an ogress. Anyway, they reached the top of the tower through a secret hatch. They ended up using Darkness and Nevram's ability to see in magical darkness to try and get an advantage, and that part didn't work that well, because he couldn't quite stand in the center of the room and cause darkness for all the bad guys without also causing darkness for all the good guys. So he kind of ran off to the side and kind of guarded the entrance while flinging Eldritch Blasts. In the end, they did take out the big bad along with her 2 henchmen, and that was the exact moment that the griffin eggs hatched, which, you know, my players kind of knew that was a given. The players are like, oh, how are we going to transport these eggs? And Zartath's players, like, we're not going to have to transport eggs. And they're like, what do you mean? He's like, we have been warned that we can't let them imprint on us if they hatch. which means they're going to hatch. And I'm like, shush you. Anyway, that was when Nevrim put his darkness into good use, and he moved over to put the hatchlings in darkness so they couldn't see anybody to imprint upon them.
Nice.
Then my players did what they always do, and they made it a little overcomplicated. They split the party, where they had Malvern taking Zartath's Cloak of Gliding, Turvin turning into a giant bee, and then Nevrim using his own natural flying to put the babies in sacks and carry them out of the top of the eyrie in the tower and fly down to a meeting point further in the forest, whereas the other three would go back down through the tower and out. I ended up giving the brigands a chance to realize something had gone wrong, and one of the ogres that was her lieutenants realized what had happened, came up to check, saw what happened, bellowed down to the bands that, like, hey, something is happening, in a much deeper, angry ogre voice. And so everything is on high alert. Inside, the folks got to the basement level and then ended up having to fight a handful of goblins that checked the basement to see what was going on and saw them try to escape through the watery tunnel. Meanwhile, the others avoided being seen flying down, but still the entire horde of goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears, and goblin captains all came surging around the tower and down the hill towards them. There was some happily used Call Lightning from Turvin, and Zartath got to draw up a very well-placed fireball to take out a large chunk of them, but there were still many of them chasing them. So at that point, they used Pass Without Trace to skedaddle off into the woods, and we will pick up with that next time. There's not too much left in this adventure, so I'm going to have to plan some extra stuff to kind of fill in before they get to 6th level. The band will still be chasing them. It's just a matter of they probably won't have the full force of the band coming down on them at this point.
I still think your players bypassing all the encounters but still finding the treasure is much better than I still remember running that Pathfinder adventure Skinsaw Murders, where they bypassed all of the encounters and the adamantine longsword that they needed for the next part of the adventure, where they fought a flesh golem, which they couldn't hurt without that adamantine longsword.
Well, the funny thing is like the way the tower is set up, they can either completely bypass the treasure or completely bypass the encounters. Like, they're in separate pathways up the tower. So I'm actually kind of glad they found the treasure, because more or less, the way things went down, they're going to fight a bunch of the stuff in the tower anyway. In Victoriana, they completed the mystery and defeated the big bad. One of my players was a bit annoyed at the actual resolution to the mystery because they thought their ideas of what was actually happening was cooler. I don't actually agree, but I do understand why they were a little frustrated with the adventure. It was complicated. Very cool ideas. But if I had to do it over again, I probably would have retooled it more than I did to, like, make it not as complicated. I don't want to say too much about it because it's a very cool adventure. It's just got a lot going on in it.
That's one of those things that gets me when it comes to running a published adventure that is a mystery, because I feel like I have to run it as close as possible, because part of it is seeing if people can figure it out. And if I don't run it the way they're telling you to run it, then I might either not give out something that you're supposed to give out, or I might, just give it all away in the first encounter or whatever. So it does make those a little more stressful. I mean, not necessarily always in a bad way, but,
I will say this. It has a very Strangers on a Train vibe, which means there are things happening that are being done by people that aren't necessarily connected to what is happening. And that makes untangling the mystery a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of pieces that they may or may not find or connect. I had to make fairly liberal use of what they call aha moments, where you basically can recontextualize some clues for your players to kind of give them a nudge in a particular direction.
I don't need you to give anything away, but is this one that was pretty much the way we ran it when we playtested it, or is this one that got reworked a lot?
This one got reworked a lot.
Okay.
Finally, we had our second to last session of City of Cowls. We defended the docks while the Northmen rode in and docked, and this was a big fight with a lot of devils. Ree got to make use of her barbarian abilities that are kind of the I could do this all day variety. Basically, if she would be knocked below 0, she gets to make a con save, and if she makes a save, she's still got 1 hit point. I think she made that con save 3 times, which means by the end she had to get a 20 result on her con save to make that. By the time we were done, I had Dove go over and use prestidigitation to clean up her armor, because we were joking that her guts were more on the outside than on the inside by the end of that fight. Anyway, we connected with the Northmen. We got back to Kraken's Maw, took stock of what was going on, decided we could afford to take a long rest, and in the morning, or whatever it is when we wake up, we go face Asmodeus. Dun, dun, dun. Thankfully, our next and last session is going to be in person. We ended up talking it out and realized we could make that happen. Ree's player is going to be bringing cake, and we also have a friend coming to join us to play his character for one last session. He started with us in the very beginning of the campaign as Fiona, but when he moved out of state, he left the campaign, and we're going to have Fiona come join us for that one last battle. We unfortunately have to wait until the 28th, but it will be worth the wait. I'm very excited for this.
I sort of ran my Ravenloft game since our last episode, and I definitely did run the penultimate session of our Midgard game. So speaking of things that only have one more session left, almost like we might have a topic that could be brewing on that sort of subject in a few weeks or so.
Considering we've been talking about that topic for about 3 months, but it's taken that long to get these campaigns wrapped up.
Exactly. So in the Ravenloft game, part of what happened was we had some people call off last minute, so we didn't quite have enough people to where we wanted to start venturing back into full-on content. And I asked everybody, I was like, if you want to roleplay out some things and explore the inn that you had just had this gigantic fight in, that's okay. But I would rather you not go outside, in part because you guys already decided at the end of the last session that you were going to take a long rest. And I don't want to change what I already started putting in motion because you guys said you were going to take a long rest. And I was trying not to tell them, you're going to find things out as soon as you go outside the next day. It's Ravenloft. There are things that are going to be going on here, but I didn't quite put it that way. So everybody stayed in the inn. They hadn't gone through and looted all of the rooms yet. One of the rooms of the inn is where Van Richten used to stay, and his journal is in there, and there's a bunch of stuff that they can find out in there yet. So they start exploring, they start looting everything. The best part about this whole session is that Isolde, the bard, finds a bag of tricks. Does not know what it is. Desperately hoping that it's a bag of holding, because they have been encumbered for so long now. They're sick of moving at 20 feet per round. She reaches in and feels this little fuzzy thing. This is what I love about people that haven't run into some of these D&D tropes yet. So she feels a little fuzzy thing and she throws it out, and we roll to see what it was, and it is a giant elk. So they're in the business office of the inn, and a giant elk appears, which literally takes up the entire room. As Isolde, you're pressed into the corner. This poor elk is just kind of standing there. I believe I actually did ask them to look up what an elk sounds like. I think that was the best possible thing that we could have rolled when she pulled that out of the bag.
It reminds me of the Eberron game I ran where they summoned, I don't remember if it was random or they summoned it, but they got a giant ox in the second floor of the inn when they were being attacked by assassin cultists, and it basically charged through the wall in Sharn.
Yeah, it's bad.
We had a long debate on whether the ox's body would like make it to the bottom of Sharn, or if it would disappear before it reached the bottom. If it did make the bottom, would the people down there be able to get meat out of it? It was just...
Oh, goodness. The funny thing was, too, like, when they were done looting everything, they decided to, like, go through all of the alcohol stores in the inn. Pretty much, they degenerated into having a drinking contest. So a lot of the whole session was just, okay, all of you roll me constitution saves. Okay, you're poisoned. You have a level of exhaustion. Yeah, just going through everyone doing this. So they're going to wake up a little hungover when we start the next session, which I'm sure will be fine when they're in Strahd von Zarovich's domain.
It'll be fine. This is fine.
In our Midgard game, we left on a cliffhanger because they were about to confront the Chosen of Loki, which is a plot thread that's been going on for a while now, and it was something that Ivy, our Aasimar sorceress, has been charged with rooting out and opposing the Chosen of Loki for a while, and our Ratatosk bard, Ratatup, is supposed to be helping her with this, so this is basically tying up a lot of our loose ends here. Chosen of Loki was the member of the mercenary company who was the least likely to be the one that was the Chosen of Loki, but she was going to impress Loki by turning on her mercenary captain and killing her at the moment when she was about to defeat this fire giant general who would have been like the greatest victory for the mercenary company ever. So the players get to her. I really love that ability that you had Kazina using. That's one of my favorite things that the Soul Knife gets to do, which is to throw the psychic dagger and teleport where it lands. I love that. So yeah, Kazina teleported to block her from going after the mercenary captain. In the meantime, Loki sent her some friends to help her out, one of which was a shadow giant, and two of which were shadow wolves. I will say there was an interesting thing about the shadow wolves, because those were literally only CR2 creatures, and one of them got a crit and still did enough damage that it caused some issues, at least about resource management, and if the giant hits me now, it's going to be a problem. I will say that goes back to the early design of 2014 D&D and the bounded accuracy. They weren't completely useless. They weren't going to defeat any of you, but they had a purpose in the encounter. They weren't just, we can ignore these things and nothing will happen. So I kind of like that.
Right.
I mean, that was the thing I was thinking. If this were 3rd edition, I remember, going back to some of those Pathfinder adventures, there were times they would throw these really low CR things in there, and the intent was that these are just for your people to plow through, but I hated running those because there was no chance that those things would do anything. They had no chance to do anything to you at all, so it just felt pointless to put them in there. It's like, I'm going to roll initiative for 5 or 6 things that we're just going to like sit here for 2 or 3 rounds while you kill these guys, and I'm going to act like it matters. That's fun.
I mean, there are times when it's fun to give the players a bunch of lower level things that they can use some of their big booms on.
Yeah.
To wipe out, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily as fun for us as the GMs, because that's a lot of accounting for very little threat on the players.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Like, the wolves kind of felt like you guys were going to be able to take care of the wolves no matter what, but they didn't feel completely worthless.
Right.
Them by themselves, they weren't a threat, but they were worth slowing you down while the dangerous people were doing stuff to you.
Yeah.
The shadow giant had 2 things going on that were a big pain in the rear end. Actually 3 if you count his recharge ability. He could fire off this cone of cold shadows. He generated this aura around him that if you failed your save, you could only take actions and movement, and if you had an attack action, you could only make one attack, which is basically saying, here's a gigantic middle finger to your martial characters. And on top of all of that, he rolled at the end of each of his turns to see if he blinked in and out of the Plane of Shadows. So even though he was not the main antagonist, he was doing a really good job of keeping three of you guys tied up while Kazina was over there fighting the Cleric of Loki. I was glad Ivy managed to break free of that in time to where she got to be the one to do the killing blow on the Chosen of Loki, because I had already determined anything she did was the Chosen of Loki had a weakness to any damage that Ivy did to her.
I'm actually really glad she also got the killing blow, although there was part of me that was, this was almost poetic justice, because she got the killing blow on my grandfather.
This is true. But you still got to negotiate with your ancestor about, getting everything free there.
If I had had one more round, I could have probably gotten the end and blow on her grandfather, but it was kind of anticlimactic for Kazine. It's like, oh, okay, he's gone. Okay. But I'm glad Ivy got the final blow on the Cleric of Loki, because that's much more fitting.
And if any of you don't remember from all of our talks about this campaign, Ivy is an Aasimar. Her ancestor is Balder. So that's why she's very focused on opposing Loki. So, as we mentioned in the last few episodes, we're using a modified version of the 3E Heroes of Battle Mass Combat resolution system, where different encounters give you different amounts of victory points, and that shows you how the overall battle is going. We took a break, and I was going to ask everybody a very, very important decision they were going to need to make at the end of this, because I was going to ask if they wanted to take a short or a long rest, because if they take a short rest, they get more victory points because they keep the momentum going. And then I looked at their point total, and they had 1 point more than they needed to get the highest level of victory for the fight. So I was like, there's no decision going on. You guys can just take a long rest.
Which we desperately kind of need.
Oh, yeah.
At least for Ivy and Karatatup.
Yeah, once you got inside the city walls, you guys have been getting ground up quite a bit and using a lot of resources. So since they took the long rest, everybody leveled up to 15th level. So we are going to end this campaign with 15th level characters. And essentially, Glavistus, the leader of the Dragon Empire forces, is really upset that she lost the city. She is going to show up personally. Had they gotten fewer victory points, she would have had reinforcements with her. And I don't want to spoil anything for Ange, but because they got total victory, they have something that resolved differently in their favor that I will tell them when they set up the next time we play.
I'm so looking forward to this.
We've got a Patreon to help us do this show. In addition to keeping the lights on, we also provide additional content meant to help you make your games better. Currently, we've got various posts granting advice on a range of topics you'll face as a GM. We've also got crunchy mechanical bits like Ancestry, Origin feats, alternate XP rules, and a look at our Masters of the Universe-inspired Daggerheart campaign frame. We would love it if you came to join us and support our show. And we have a Discord that anyone can join. Come over and have a chat at patreon.com/THAC0WA.
Welcome to the Dungeon Master's Workshop.
We've touched on the concept of space fantasy and space opera in the past, and how it shares many tropes with epic fantasy. We thought we'd take an episode to look at how to tie your fantasy gaming to space opera, especially in light of the increasing number of systems using the 5th edition SRD to present sci-fi settings. Before we dive into this, though, let's look at some definitions. How do we describe space opera and planetary romance or sword and planet genres? Take it away, Jared.
All right. So Merriam-Webster says that a space opera is a futuristic melodramatic fantasy involving space travelers and extraterrestrial beings. My best examples of this would be Star Wars or Dune. If you're going to have magic that isn't magic, both of those have magic that isn't magic.
Yeah, very much so.
And the adjacent thing that I wanted to also kind of touch on is the Oxford Dictionary of Science Fiction categorizes planetary romance as a genre of science fiction that describes an adventure taking place on a planet's surface, especially in which the description of the planet is integral to the story. The reason I bring this up is because there is a lot of planetary romance where you have people from one world show up on a different world, and on that different world there are these weird things that they can do, and, you know, things that look like magic, and you might have people with ray guns fighting people with swords. That happens a lot in planetary romance. The classic example of this would be John Carter of Mars. I would also argue that Masters of the Universe is kind of this genre.
I think you could also maybe toss Flash Gordon in that pile.
Oh, yeah. I think the main thing that kind of keeps Flash Gordon a little more on the space opera side is that they do sometimes travel to other places, but yeah.
One of the things to point out here is that it's the same thing with comic books and superhero stories. We can say this thing as a type of game, but there are so many variations within that umbrella. So we can say science fiction, space opera, but that can mean anything from Star Wars to Dune to John Carter of Mars.
Mm-hmm.
We throw Star Wars and Dune into the same bucket, and they are dramatically different from one another.
But they are about galactic empires where these big things are happening and you have big heroic characters in them.
Yes, very much so. There's slight tonal differences, I'd say.
Oh, yeah.
So we've talked about this before, but what kind of pedigree does space opera have in D&D? Come on, talk about Expedition to the Barrier Peaks.
Oh, yeah. We'll definitely touch on that, but I think one of the things that's really important to touch on here is a lot of the early designers of D&D grew up reading those pulp magazines, and those pulp magazines did not say, this is just for fantasy or this is just for science fiction. They might have something that leans more one way or leans more the other way, but they also had these like planetary romance things where this person shows up who is an excellent swordsman, and also these people have lightning rifles.
I come by my nerd cred genetically. My dad has been a science fiction and fantasy nerd for as long as he could read. And so as I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we had many of those fiction magazines coming to the house regularly, you know, and it's a very weird concept for anyone who didn't experience them back in the days of print media, but it would be a thick magazine, usually digest size, that had like 4 to 6 stories in it, you know, all ranging from science fiction, fantasy, depending, whatever that genre was. And there was a lot of pulp stories in them.
Horror crossed over into a lot of those things too. I mean, literally, these are the types of magazines where Lovecraft got his start. And just to show the crossover between all of these genres, that's also where, you know, Howard started putting stuff from like the Cthulhu mythos into Conan. So all of a sudden you have this cosmic horror, which really is science fiction, but then pulling that back into these ancient cults that Conan is running into.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of cross-pollination, and that was really the stuff that these people were reading when they first designed D&D. One of the earliest things that TSR published was Metamorphosis Alpha, which was this RPG where you were playing these people that were sort of, you know, thinking that you were from this primitive society where you had swords and you were hunters and gatherers and you were worrying about, you know, animals jumping out of nowhere. And you were actually on a generational ship that had, you know, lost all of its, you know, communication to explain to you that you were actually colonists from Earth going to another planet. So you would like slowly find out that, oh, wait, here, what is this weird tube thing? Oh, I just burned a hole through my friend.
Was the way that one was set up, was it like you were all in like underground in tunnels, or?
No, I think the idea was like the dome of the thing kind of looked like solar panel, so it looked more like sky, and you'd be in this forest area, but then all of a sudden you found out, wait, there's an end to the forest. What is this weird, you know, wall that is at the edge of the forest? And then you open it up and you find like the engine room. But a lot of that was, you know, you're running around with a sword and this giant mutant radiation modified bear jumps out at you, which could just be like some legendary fantasy creature. And it's like, no, that's a bear from the habitat that got mutated by the shielding breaking off of the thing and all of that. And that's one of the first things that TSR did after Dungeons and Dragons. But because Metamorphosis Alpha was something that Gygax and a lot of the people really liked, that led to Gygax writing Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, which is somewhat similar, but it is about a starship that is basically a prison cruiser crashing into the world of Greyhawk, and then you exploring this thing where you know that it's a spaceship. Your characters don't know that it's a spaceship. That's also where we get some of the really weird D&D monsters that we sit there and go, where the hell did this come from? Like the froggy moth, which is a giant frog with tentacles and eyes on eye stalks, and the wolf in sheep's clothing, which literally looks like a tree stump with a rabbit on top, and it has tentacles and a mouth that reach out and grab you if you get too close to the rabbit. Extremely specialized genetic, development on that creature there.
Yeah, sometimes in D&D, you just don't want to dig too deep into why.
But I mean, there's also like mainstay things in D&D that come from science fiction stories. It's very hard not to see that mind flayers come from cosmic horror type stories. They literally look like mini Cthulhu's walking around, except they don't have the wings. And I mean, just the whole process of how illithids make more illithids is so cosmic horror, but it fits into fantasy.
Thank you, Baldur's Gate 3.
And the other thing that I would bring up is the Displacer Beast. People love Displacer Beasts. They're so D&D.
Kitty!
They're also ripped almost completely from a story that was a science fiction story that was also kind of the same story that inspired Aliens, because this Displacer Beast thing was stalking people on the ship and killing them, and it was an alien creature that they brought onto the ship. So I mean, that's where Displacer Beasts come from.
So what are some connections between D&D's core system and space opera?
So there were, especially when Wizards of the Coast got the Star Wars license, you literally had 2 editions of just the Star Wars RPG and then Star Wars Saga Edition, which was also a D20 level-based game, but it had a lot of prototypical 4th edition stuff in it too.
Yeah, I played Saga Edition. Well, I played both of them, but we ended up using some of the rules in Star Wars Saga Edition in an Eberron campaign to basically change the lethality of it, change certain aspects of it. And there's some interesting ideas there, but it is still all D20 based.
Yeah, and I think the thing to really drive home there is it's not just level based. It is like, if you are a scoundrel, that is effectively a space rogue. Like, there are some things that it doesn't do that a rogue does, but it's pretty much the same niche that you're performing when you're... So it's really creating these niche protected different types of professions in the game system.
Now, there are arguments that can be made about whether or not D20 worked for Star Wars, because any Star Wars system you deal with, you have this kind of conflict between the Jedi stories and characters and the other characters and their stories.
What's interesting to me about that is I think Star Wars works great for Star Wars because it is very much epic fantasy. Like, Luke Skywalker is 100% a zero to hero type character. Like, he is exactly a D&D character. The problem you have is that in the setting, Jedi and other people are not on the same tier. And it's always hard to kind of balance that reality in a game.
But that was also a problem in the West End D6 version of Star Wars, where, yeah, you can play a Jedi. You're going to be as useless as a first edition, first level wizard, but you can play a Jedi.
The other thing that came out of all of this was Wizards of the Coast did D20 Future. It definitely had space opera setting for it. It wasn't just space opera, but it really was their, here is a more generic setting that is based on the D20 system. It's still level based. What's a little bit different about D20 Future is you didn't have a Jedi or a scoundrel. You had classes that were based on, you are really good at doing strength things. You are really good at doing dexterity things. So it wasn't the same kind of specific niche that like being a rogue or a scoundrel was.
Let's pause a moment. I want to have a conversation about Star Trek. Why does Star Trek not fall into the same space opera bucket?
It's really hard because Star Trek, I believe, from most definitions, is space opera. The problem is that Star Trek doesn't act like space opera as much as other things. Like, the heroic narrative isn't necessarily that the big champion guy picks up the big heavy weapon and defeats the monster. It is the big-brained guy outthinks what the monster actually is and realizes it's not a monster and unplugs the machine. You know what I mean? It's that subversion of how things usually end.
I think also Star Trek tends to try and stay more... This is not the case. I try and stay more true to actual science in its science fiction. It's not there. It's not real hard science, but I think it tries to stay closer than what we see in space opera, Star Wars, and Dune.
Yeah. You get really trippy things that might talk about psychic things in Dune, where it's like, we're folding space over to appear from one place to the other, and that is kind of a scientific thing, but it is not the explanation that a warp bubble is that has actually been theorized. It's just, we're nowhere near figuring out whether this actually works or not.
Star Trek and Star Wars are a lot more closely aligned than I think the hardcore fans of either one really wants to talk about, but they do have different methods for how they approach their storytelling.
Yeah, like the important thing about a hyperdrive in Star Wars is it faster than this other hyperdrive? But if you ask a Star Trek fan about a warp engine, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, in Star Wars, it's spaceship go vroom.
Yeah. I have the faster vroom than you.
Whereas in Star Trek, you'll get a lot more technobabble about the warp engine and what it's capable of and what you're working with and all of that.
We're going to extend the warp bubble over something else so that we can pull this other thing with us. And yeah, all these other things that Star Wars doesn't care. Star Wars is just as likely to have a Wookiee stand outside with a helmet on and throw a hook to tow something. Yeah.
We're not going to worry about zero-G space that much. We don't want to. We don't have the budget for that. I've actually said that in some of the science fiction games I've run. Well, what about, does this ship have gravity? Yes, this ship has gravity because the showrunners do not have the budget to have you on wires for the entire episode.
Just as a side tangent, anything that is trying to be more hard science fiction, but it's in the near future and people are walking around on space stations and they have gravity. I remember it was some show that I was watching where they even explain that the space station has to rotate so that they have gravity. And then the power goes out and it's not rotating. And the people inside are worried about running out of oxygen. And they're still walking. Because they didn't have the budget to be in zero gravity.
Yeah.
One of the other things I definitely wanted to touch on when we're talking about D&D adjacent things that are specifically in the space opera genre is Starfinder, because that predates all of these 5e people that have been getting into the space opera setting. And I will admit, I have not been able to play Starfinder, but I will also say that there is a very visceral thing that I like about things like Starfinder's equipment lists, because on one hand, a lot of it is an excuse to say a 20th level plasma rifle does more damage than a first level one. But there's also something cool about it saying that it is a multi-watt, hyperphase plasma rifle with extra conductive whatever, and seeing that it says, like, this does 12d10 damage and causes this condition.
I also think it's important to, we are not talking about Spelljammer.
No.
Spelljammer flirts with space opera, but it is not space opera. It is D&D in a multi-dimensional space.
Yeah, this is a weird. Jared gets like bent out of shape over this thing over the years because the way traditional Spelljammer does things, they are not talking about you using a starship that uses any science as any kind of logic for how you fly. You are on a magic chair that makes a galleon lift up out of the ocean and fly through the air. And air just follows you out of the atmosphere. That's a little different than even Star Wars cares a little bit more about what we know is true about space than to try that sort of thing.
Yeah. What are some of the incoming wave of space opera content that we're seeing that is related to the 5e SRD? Because there's several of them coming.
Oh, yeah. The very first one that really kind of hit the scene was Esper Genesis. And I would say Esper Genesis to me has a very Mass Effect feel to it, but it does do, as we are saying, there is that, for the type of space opera that we were talking about, we are looking at something where there is the equivalent of what magic would be in a high fantasy setting. And sometimes that is disguised as this sort of super science that we don't fully understand that lets people do things. Sometimes it is literally there is magic alongside technology. Esper Genesis is not there is magic alongside technology, but there is also these ancient alien artifacts that create this substance called thorium that allows people to do things above and beyond what we've ever been able to do, so we don't fully understand it. And the existence of those things is part of what society is based on, which kind of reminds me of the relays a little bit in Mass Effect. So that's kind of the vibe you're getting there. But the thing about Esper Genesis that I kind of like, but literally every class is a reflavored version of a D&D class. So, like, you will have a paladin, you're not swearing an oath to anything, but you do have this, like, thorium thing that is implanted in you that lets you, build up a thing that lets you smite somebody.
I love Mass Effect. It's one of my favorite things in the world.
The other thing that I think is worth mentioning, even though it is a fan project, the Star Wars 5e fan project has been huge. And when I say it's been huge, they've used it multiple times on Dimension 20. It is really interesting because they don't sell it, so they haven't been shut down yet. It is a massive, update to a D20 version of Star Wars. And I have looked at it a lot. I kind of like it as far as running characters. The vehicle stuff feels like it's still a little not entirely completely done, sort of, because like there's not like, here is a YT 1300 stats. It's like, here are the shipbuilding rules we came up with. You can build a YT 1300 with it. And it's like, I kind of wish it was a little more solid about things like that, but it is a major, major project. And obviously, like we're saying, the Force is essentially magic. Doesn't matter what midichlorians are. It's basically magic. Another one that's already out, but just kickstarted I'm going to say a D&D 5.5, because in the time since the last time we recorded and now, WotC has officially said D&D 2024 is 5.5 because we're tired of hearing people say 2024.
I wish I'd just done this like 3 years ago.
But the dark matter setting came out for the original 5th edition rules, and they just did a Kickstarter for the 5.5 ones. Dark matter is another setting that is a lot like Starfinder, where it is this, space opera, but there's literally magic as well. So you actually have sorcerers and wizards alongside engineers and stuff that are, doing things out in space. And the one that just got announced that's going to be kickstarting in May is Neon Odyssey, which is also kind of like Dark Matter, except it is like so leaning into 80s vibes. Like when it says Neon Odyssey, like everything is in neon colors in this thing. I am very fascinated by this because it's being done by the Legends of Evantris people, which also means it has a lot of the game designers that worked on the Crooked Moon project. And I'm really, really curious to see what this looks like.
You say the 80s, and I can like almost hear this product as a special edition cartoon that you get to see randomly on TV if you can find it.
They're going to replay it next year at this one time. The other thing that's kind of funny about all this is, even though Star-Lord is a character that exists canonically, like in the now in the MCU, it also feels like he fits in that sort of setting.
Very much so. So why is epic or heroic fantasy so closely related to space opera?
I won't read all of the quotes to you here, but I found 2 quotes. One of them's by Lee Brackett. One of them's by George R.R. Martin. Lee Brackett is basically saying that space opera is the evolution of the same stories that we have been telling since the beginning of time, of a hero standing against darkness and the unknown. It is the same thing. We just learn new trappings as we invent and create new things. George R.R. Martin basically was a little bit more blunt, where he's just basically saying it's just fantasy, but you're using different words to describe things. You're saying Duralloy and Starship instead of dragon and, armor plate. The funny thing about this, the reason I picked those 2 quotes, though, is that Lee Brackett is the woman that wrote the screenplay for Empire Strikes Back. George R.R. Martin, obviously, is the guy that wrote Game of Thrones. So from both sides of this, from the epic fantasy side and from the space opera side, they're both saying, yeah, it's the same thing.
It's that The Office meme. They're the same picture. They're the same picture.
Like we said before, there are just so many, that heroic journey, for however much you want to tie it directly to exactly how that is written out. It is that same thing. You have the hero face a big challenge. You have a hero find out there's a bigger challenge to face. That is the thing that you are seeing in space opera.
And while we tend to associate the term fantasy to very specifically the medieval trappings that are in modern D&D, fantasy just means that, exactly. It's a fantasy. It doesn't have to have those particular trappings. It can have any trappings. It just has to have fantastical stuff in the world with the characters able to do big heroic things.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that, in some cases we put those medieval mythical trappings on it. And other times we put these futuristic sci-fi trappings on it. Other times we put them in capes and in the middle of Manhattan and say, go.
It is also interesting to me that a lot of times it feels like we start a genre that is very fantastical, but we still kind of want to ground it, quote unquote, by coming up with explanations for things. And eventually somebody just says, no, there's just magic here too. I think you can see that in the MCU, because even like the first Thor movie felt like they were leaning a lot more into, oh no, Asgardians are aliens. They just use technology that kind of looks like Norse stuff. And like by the time the third movie comes out, it's like, no, it's just magic. It's like they know space people, but it's also magic.
I remember when Frozen came out. I imagine most of you have seen Frozen. If you haven't, it's a singing Disney cartoon, but it's good. I remember stumbling onto this little pocket of the internet where somebody was bitching about how they didn't explain where Elsa's powers came from. It doesn't make any sense. Where did her powers come from? What is this? There's no world building here. And I was just like, my dude, it's a fairy tale. She talked to little stone men and they gave her powers, okay?
And then this bald guy showed up and wanted to recruit her for this team.
Yeah, exactly. But it was like, sometimes the point isn't the actual concrete, explainable reason why certain things exist.
Yeah.
In some stories, we want to feel like we have a better grounded response to that. But even if you dig into it too far, it realistically can't happen. I remember reading something about Ant-Man and how if somebody actually had the powers of Ant-Man and were able to shrink down, they would die instantly because of these X, Y, and Z actual scientific reasons. And I'm like, I don't care. I want my little man riding a flying ant.
honestly, that was part of the fan backlash at the time in the prequels with midichlorians. Because people were like, no, we already know the Force is a mystic energy field that binds and penetrates all of us, and life creates it and flows between us. Like, that was enough. It's a mystic energy field. We're cool.
Yeah, and I think I get what George was trying to do in the prequels, because the prequels were supposed to be this more civilized time when the galactic civilization was unified and more with it, and hadn't descended into the chaos that was the Empire and the outlying planets and all of that. But at the same time, it's like, George, you didn't need to go there. Nobody cared.
Not that anyone listens to us to find out this, but I will defend the prequels when people get too negative on them as a good concept, but I will also concede George is not good at dialogue, and sometimes he goes off the rails with details.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's also important to point out that those of us who are of an age who saw the original 3 movies in the theaters, that's our Star Wars. There are millennials who saw the prequels for the first time in the theaters. Those are their movies.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got Gen Z kids who saw the sequels, and those are their movies. We don't need to be jerks about it to each other. Let's just say there's some good and bad in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Empire is probably the best one out of all of them. Let's move on with our lives. It's pretty obvious that space opera includes magic, but it doesn't always call it magic. How does this affect your potential campaign?
I think the thing is, if you are reskinning an existing fantasy rule set, as we've been saying, you don't need to go into deep explanations, but I think you do need to have a little bit of an explanation for what your magic is. Is there literally magic alongside your super science? That is completely a possibility. But also, as we've been saying, the Force is essentially magic, it's tied into religion, it's tied into maybe there's a scientific explanation, but it is definitely your magic. And even to this extent, Mass Effect with biotics.
Yeah.
Biotics just does stuff.
The thing that makes the difference here are the trappings.
Mm-hmm.
In Mass Effects, biotics are essentially psychic abilities that the character is channeling into helping them in combat, helping them do other things. In the grand scheme of thing, it's essentially magic.
Mm-hmm.
But the trappings work for the setting.
Mm-hmm.
It's also got some cool story bits about biotics have to have, certain, enhancements done to themselves, and the early ones weren't very good, and they give people headaches all the time, but they've gotten better, and there's a lot of cool stuff there. It boils down to, it's magic, but it is not directly taking an entire magic system from a fantasy setting and dropping it into the science fiction setting.
Yeah.
It's taking pieces and having special abilities that basically allow the characters to do more than human stuff in the setting.
Now, this is where you still have a lot more experience than I do, but I did play quite a bit of it years and years ago. This is something that I think Savage Worlds is really good at, because a lot of their powers are literally telling you, this is Bolt. You are using some form of power to injure somebody at range. You explain what it does.
Yep. The big thing in Savage Worlds is they give you the basic power and then you put the trappings on it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take a special background to be able to use the said powers, and then you are supposed to frame the trappings for the power related to whatever background that is. You can have an arcane background. Hey, you're a wizard, Harry. You can have weird science where you get to be Doc Brown doing, time travel shenanigans. You have psychic abilities, miracles, where it's basically you're tapping into your faith and godly stuff. I happen to be thinking about a lot of this right now because I'm working on the characters that I need to run in a few days at the convention I'm going to that I'm not done with yet. And it's a science fiction game, so yeah. But it basically just pulls them together. You put the framework you want on it, and then you flavor it however you need to. The Savage Supers book takes it like a step further because everything is about the powers. So it does things a little different, but the concepts are similar.
And I think it's worth mentioning while we're talking about this, the thing that you were talking about with biotics, about how people have to have the implants and the things, to help them do these things. The things like with Dune, where like it's the people, with the Bene Gesserit that learn how to use the voice and all of the abilities. Not just everyone can use the Force. Even, you have to actually train and, be in the right mindset and everything. The thing about your magic is, whether you're explaining it as science or whether you're explaining it as literal magic, not everyone can do it. You're at least somewhat special if you can do it.
Yeah. There's the what is it, Arthur C. Clarke quote about any sufficiently advanced technology is just going to be magic.
Mm-hmm.
That quote is talking about when you have people from like our world interacting with aliens and super technology and stuff like that. If you are in, you're running a science fiction game, a space opera game, you're still going to have all this fantastical technology that does stuff, but that is common. That is what people are used to. Your transporter technology, it just happens. It doesn't. We're not going to think too hard about it because then we'd go crazy. But then you have the special characters who have whatever, quote unquote, magic it is. That's a slightly different thing.
I think that's actually another kind of interesting thing about Star Trek is Star Trek does tend to explain and expand some of that stuff a little bit more than, say, Star Wars or something else, because all Vulcans could learn more about telepathy, but they have a limited amount of telepathy. Like it is a little bit different how they frame stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I was going to point out that you may not think of as magic too, because we're talking about like psychic stuff or spiritual stuff or literal magic. The other thing is weird science. It is literally kind of a form of magic if you have someone that is so smart that they make things that are not mass produced and only super genius people that tinker around with stuff can make it. That's still magic in a setting like that. That's
why Savage Worlds has the arcane background, weird science.
And I think it's even interesting to look at like Esper Genesis, for example. A lot of the gear that you can get is still done sort of like magic items, because the stuff that is really good, that does the really neat stuff, is not mass produced yet. It's still like a prototype, so it's not something that you can just go out and get. You have to find somebody that has already built this, and it's kind of like Sorium Forged is what they call it, but it's somebody that's been experimenting with Sorium to see how can we make this work.
Let's say you want to mix and match fantasy and space opera. What do you need to let your players know before you get started with this game?
We've been talking about how it's just trappings, but the devil is in the details. If you have devils in your space game, that might be a problem for people. That might be a detail they don't want. I mean, there are people where if you threw like a vampire into Star Wars, they would not be happy. But you throw a ghost in there, I don't care. That kind of seems like it goes with the Force. You have to really have an idea of what your players think is too far for the setting that you're establishing.
Now, you could throw a psychic vampire into your Star Wars game.
Yes. And there are those in the setting where, people just drain life force off of you, but they don't necessarily sleep in coffins or, sink fangs into you. So the concept of a vampire still works.
I think if you're planning on running a one-shot, just set it up, give your players a good premise on what the setting is, and then just roll with it. If you're going to run a campaign, you need to have a really solid session zero with you. Talk with your players about what is in this world and what place their characters have in this world. One of the reasons why I struggle with Numenera is I've never been able to figure out what place my character has in this world. What is life like for people in this world? It's got some very interesting concepts, but I've bounced off of it because I couldn't ground my character and their daily life in it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to run a campaign, you need to set some parameters. You don't need to build the world completely. You can still build it as you go, but you need to have some parameters to keep consistency with what your players expect and what they know before you start deviating from it to build the world further.
And I mean, there's even some things like in Star Wars, for example, there are characters that we kind of assume just use the Force, but because of their traditions, they call it magic or sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing, like, okay, if we have this person and they're a witch, are they just using the stuff that you already use, but they just think it's magic or they just call it magic? That's the kind of discussions you need to have. This is, I think what I really want to hammer home with this, though, is this is one of those classic things that you have GMs that feel like they're super clever, where it's like everybody made up D&D characters and haha, you're actually in a sci-fi setting, you didn't realize it, and it's like, that's not what I wanted to play, though.
Yeah, exactly. You don't need to give away everything if you want to do something like that, but you're probably going to need to let your players know that the world is not exactly as they expect, to be prepared for things to kind of go a little weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think now, especially, if you're going to play through Expedition to the Barrier Peak, you're probably letting your players know that's what you're doing. Your characters don't know this is the spaceship. So let's have fun with you pretending that, but you know it's a spaceship.
Yep.
I'm not telling you that you're going into a dungeon that is actually a traditional dungeon.
How hard is it to do planetary romance as a default fantasy setting?
I think we actually have a lot of good examples of like fantasy settings that end up actually being planetary romance. Two things I wanted to touch on because they're kind of three. Sometimes people will say planetary romance has to be somewhere other than Earth. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think if you're far enough removed from the Earth we know now, that still counts as a planetary romance. But the funny thing to me is both the Shannara books and the Wheel of Time books end up being, hey, wait a minute, we're on Earth. We're just in the future.
Spoilers, Jared!
The funny thing about that, too, is I am almost certain that both of those series took a lot longer to reveal that in the book series, and the TV series based on them just threw it out there right off the bat.
I will say, I bounced off of both of those series. I read the first book and was like, I don't like these people. They're boring. I'm going to go read something else. And that's no offense to the fans who like Shannara or the Wheel of Time. I have some friends who adore Wheel of Time. I have a friend who runs a fantastic Savage Worlds Wheel of Time game and campaign. It's just something that I did not get into when I was reading them.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't think either of those counts as your super traditional planetary romance, but it is kind of that idea that it is a fantasy setting, but it's a fantasy setting built on top of something that isn't fantasy. Thundar the Barbarian, that's much more in my mind a planetary romance, even though, again, it takes place on Earth, but this is an Earth where the moon cracked in half and, you know, everything changed and you have literal sorcerers on top of, like, finding old world nuclear bombs and stuff.
I think Thundar was much more obvious, the post-apocalyptic fantasy opera type of setting where it's like, oh, I can recognize that this was once the world we knew and now stuff is happening. Whereas the other two examples were, it's a fantasy world.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you find out it's much more closely related is like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and I think the point that I'm making too with Thundar is you can literally run a Thundar game and say, we're just using D&D classes. Like, it works in that setting. You can do that and then have somebody find an antimatter rifle, which, again, they actually have those in the DMG, so, like, it's not even that hard to do that. So I guess what I'm saying there is you can do traditional fantasy and layer things in. I don't even think letting people know that the dungeon is in a collapsed skyscraper, but in this world there are orcs and dragons, ruins the idea that this is still basically a D&D style setting. I'll throw this in there again just because there's a movie coming out of this. Did we mention there's a movie coming out of this? And also, did we mention we have a Daggerheart campaign frame that's sort of like this? Masters of the Universe. Again, that is definitely planetary romance because it's people going to Eternia, which is a separate world, but there's ties to Earth, and it is just, for lack of a better term, weird shit top to bottom. It's magic and science, and are they the same thing? It really doesn't matter. It's just weird shit. But again, I think you could probably run a Masters of the Universe game using D&D classes. I don't think it's really that hard. That's actually kind of the opposite of what you might do in some other settings where it's like, no, you can play Tabaxi, you can play, Turtles. You almost have to, because those are settings where weird other species are way more common than they are even in some fantasy settings.
So what do you do if your players don't want to cross the streams and mix their fantasy and their science fiction, and they don't like peanut butter cups?
So we already touched on this a little bit before, but find out exactly what it is they don't like. And I think that's important anyway, because there's times you might even not think that something is you throwing science fiction into your fantasy, and they think of it that way. There are people that think like black powder rifles are too much to have show up in a D&D setting. And to me, that still works, especially if not everybody has them. Them existing doesn't bother me any, but for some people, that's no. I don't want anybody using any kind of gun. It has to be bows and arrows and crossbows, and that's it. So you really need to find out where that line is. Don't force the point. It's not just your campaign. Your opinion matters, but it's not just your opinion that matters.
Right.
And I also, here's my biggest piece of wisdom. Take it for what it is. If they're here to play Lord of the Rings, don't try and replace Sauron with Skeletor.
Don't do that thing.
I'll have all the rings now!
Oh, we gotta get out of here.
Now let's join Ange and Jared for some downtime research, where they do the work so we don't have to.
Every episode, we're going to look for something related to D&D that we want to pass along to the listeners. It might be products, websites, videos, or podcasts, but it will always be something that we think will enhance your D&D experience.
My brain is currently consumed with the convention that I need to finish prepping for in the next 24 hours. So let me just mention Origins. Origins will be happening June 17th through the 21st, and Event Reg opens on April 26th at noon. You'll be able to peruse the event schedule before that. So my recommendation is, if you are going, figure out some first, second, and third choices and make a plan, because tickets for RPGs go fast. It's worth jumping in as soon as you can to get some good games. If you can basically try and get into Event Reg on the 26th. Origins does a queue system where once it hits noon, you basically are in it, you get into the queue, and your number comes up and you can get your events. It's anyone who's been to one of the larger conventions knows that it's a scramble to get your RPG events. So my recommendation is take a look, see if there's anything you really, really want, and try and get into it then. Otherwise, just come to Origins. There's still a lot of good stuff.
I tried not to make this just like a D&D news thing, but WotC has been really tight-lipped about what's coming up with D&D for a while now, because we got a whole bunch of stuff with like the new Forgotten Realms books coming out and Eberron and all of that at the end of last year, and then nothing. Nobody knew what was happening in 2026. People were starting to wonder, like, what even is going to happen in 2026? And now there's just a ton of news that has finally come out about all this stuff. And some of it I think is interesting because it's not just product, it is mindset that is a little bit different than it has been before. So there's a new Ravenloft sourcebook coming out. There's a new sourcebook that's just going to be about magic. And there's going to be an adventure featuring the Red Wizards of Thac. But the thing that's kind of interesting about all this is WotC is organizing these things into seasons. If you played Adventurers League, you kind of know they used to sort of do seasons around like, oh, Tomb of Annihilation is out. So that is what all Adventurers League stuff is. All of the adventures that aren't part of the hardback are still going to be themed to tie into that. They are doing this now like on a company level where during a certain time period, they are going to be talking about that book and hyping up that book and, or that theme, I should say, because the Red Wizards of Thac and the book are part of the Arcane season. And they're talking about how they want to release other products that tie into those things. The thing I want to touch on that I think is interesting is I completely agree when people were worried about people talking about they need to monetize D&D more. When people were worried that meant, oh, they're going to like sell us just one class or one subclass, or things are going to be like, online only through D&D Beyond. what they're looking at doing now is saying, okay, some people really like art, so we're going to maybe put out an art book that is tied to this season. We're going to try and maybe do like a one-shot comic book through, Dark Horse for this season. So that's the kind of stuff that they're looking at doing in that season. And honestly, this is pretty good because they got really bad going into the anniversary of saying, hey, buy this next book, buy this next book. Hey, this next book's out. Hey, buy this next book. We're not talking about that other book anymore, even though this other thing isn't out for 3 months. So it really kind of felt like once something came out, they just quit talking about it. It was dead. It was dead and gone. Once it hits the stores, we're not even bothering with it anymore. So I like this idea of them actually spending a little bit more time hyping these things up. They're supposed to be building a new program where they're going to do D&D encounters again, where you're going to be able to play short adventures at game stores, and they're going to be releasing things specific to the game store for them to play. Like, for example, the Ravenloft thing is a source book. It's not an adventure, but they're going to have like a adventure that people will be able to run at game stores that will be a Ravenloft tied-in thing. I think all this is really good. And on top of all this, they are formally announced, not just saying we should really do this, that they are going to be changing the rules interface on D&D Beyond. They're going to be changing the character builder. They are basically rebuilding it from scratch so that it actually works in a more modular manner and not just exactly how things worked in 2014.
Having built some characters on D&D Beyond, there's room for improvement there.
It was awesome when it first came out.
I was really mad at the spell sheets.
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing on them except the name of the spell.
Yeah.
There's no useful information there. And it was 6 pages of spells.
Yeah. So, I mean, they've been needing to do that sort of infrastructure work on D&D Beyond for a while. I think what actually kind of stalled them out was them working on Thac0 as their big, like, 3D platform. And that took all of the people that had computer knowledge out of doing anything other than just doing maintenance on D&D Beyond.
Yeah.
And now that that's gone, thank goodness, not because they just didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
And it was a big draw of money and manpower, and they need it on the actual D&D Beyond website. So we're going to have a link that has the calendar release, and I'm also going to throw a link into the state of the game thing that they did that was a follow-up video where they talk about all these things too. So we will have that in the show notes.
We are happily part of the Polygamers Podcast Network, helping you run and play your best games. We think you'll enjoy another Polygamers podcast like
the Gnome Cast. Several gnomes from Gnome Stew get together to talk about gaming topics and themselves in an effort to entertain you and to avoid being thrown in the stew.
Sploosh. We've used up all our resources, so I think it's time for a long rest. I hope this adventure was rewarding for you, and we hope you go exploring with us when we start our next adventure.